In the heart of England, there is a vast, rugged wilderness of dark moorland and dramatic valleys. This is the Peak District, the country's first ever national park. It is a place of raw, elemental beauty, and at its very center lies one of its most famous landmarks, a vast, beautiful, Y-shaped expanse of water called the Ladybower Reservoir. On a still day, its surface is a perfect mirror, reflecting the sky and the dark forested hillsides. Thousands come here to walk its perimeter, to cycle its paths, to photograph its stunning, cathedral-like Victorian dams. It is seen as a triumph of engineering, a monumental piece of infrastructure that provides life-giving water to the great industrial cities of Sheffield, Derby, and Leicester. But this beauty is a mask. This tranquil surface is a tombstone. Because Ladybower is not a natural lake. It was not carved by glaciers or shaped by rivers. It was created by an act of deliberate, calculated destruction. It is a man-made flood, a valley drowned on purpose. And beneath that dark, reflective water, an entire world lies buried. 2 villages are down there. 2 fully formed communities erased from the map to quench the thirst of the cities. Their names are Derwent and Ashopton. Unlike Tyneham, which was sacrificed for war, these villages were sacrificed for progress. They were not casualties of conflict, but casualties of industry. Their story is a chilling testament to the brutal, unseen price that is sometimes paid for the conveniences of modern life. The water in your tap, the light from your switch. For decades after the valley was flooded, a single defiant object would emerge from the water when the reservoir's levels ran low. It was the spire of Derwent's village church, rising from the depths like the hand of a drowned man. It was a ghostly, terrifying reminder of the community that had been forcibly evacuated, its homes, its farms, its pub, and its school, all submerged beneath 100 feet of water. This is not a story of a natural disaster. This is the story of an execution. This is the story of the communities that were told they had to die, so that the great cities could live. Before it was a reservoir, the upper Derwent Valley was considered one of the most beautiful, secluded valleys in all of England. This was not a harsh, empty landscape. It was a living, working community, sheltered by the high moors of the dark peak. 2 villages, Derwent and Ashopton, formed the valley's heart. Derwent, the more picturesque of the 2, was a classic English idyll. It was built of gritstone, with a small 17th century church, a manor hall called Derwent Hall, a grand Jacobean house that had once hosted King George V, and a cluster of sturdy farms. It was a place of quiet, generational continuity. Ashopton was its working-class neighbor, a bustling village that sat on the main road between Sheffield and Manchester. It was a vital stopping point, with a popular coaching inn, the Ashopton Inn, a post office, and several shops. This was the valley's connection to the outside world, a place of commerce and news. Life in this valley was self-contained. The people were farmers, shepherds, quarrymen, and innkeepers. They were accustomed to the harsh Peak District winters, accustomed to being cut off by snow and fiercely proud of their independence. But while they were isolated from many things, they could not escape the shadow of the Industrial Revolution, which was raging just over the hills. By the early 1900s, the great industrial cities, Sheffield, Manchester, Leicester, were expanding at a terrifying rate. Their factories, mills, and tenement buildings were swallowing up the landscape. And this vast, thirsty industrial machine needed one thing above all else: water. Millions and millions of gallons of it, every single day. The city corporations looked to the hills, to the high moorlands of the Peak District, which received massive amounts of rainfall. They saw the deep, V-shaped valleys not as places to live, but as perfect natural containers. They were, quite simply, pre-made reservoirs. All you had to do was plug one end. This was the great, ruthless logic of the Victorian and Edwardian engineers. And the Derwent Valley was their prime target. The plan was audacious. The Derwent Valley Water Board was formed, a powerful conglomerate of city corporations. They planned not just one, but a staircase of 3 massive reservoirs to tame the entire valley. They began work at the turn of the century. First, they built Howden, then they built Derwent. They These two earlier dams, built between 1901 and 1916, were monumental feats of engineering, but they sat above the villages, sparing them. For a time, the valley lived in a strange, uneasy balance. The villagers of Derwent and Ashopton coexisted with the dams. They watched as thousands of navvies, construction workers, lived in a temporary tin town nearby, and they even hosted King George V for the dam's opening ceremony. They had become a tourist attraction. People came to marvel at the giant dams and then have tea in Ashopton. But the cities kept growing. The thirst was unquenchable. By the 1920s, the water board decided the first two dams were not enough. They needed the third and final reservoir, the biggest of them all. They called it Ladybower. There was only one problem. The proposed site for this new colossal dam was not above the villages. It was below them. If Ladybower were to be built, the entire inhabited heart of the valley, every farm, every road, every cottage, the Ashopton Inn, Derwent Hall, and Derwent's 17th century church would be submerged. The plan was not just to build a dam, it was to deliberately and permanently drown two entire villages. The decision was made. The plans were drawn up. The valley and the two villages of Derwent and Ashopton were condemned. For the residents, this was not a distant, bureaucratic decision. It was a declaration of war on their very existence. This was not 1943, with the patriotic urgency of a global conflict to justify the sacrifice. This was the 1930s, a time of uneasy peace, and the enemy was not a foreign power, but their own neighboring cities. The enemy was progress. The valley fought back. This was not a quiet, resigned surrender like Tynem's. The people of Derwent and Ashopton waged a bitter, desperate, and public campaign for years. They were led by local figures of stature, including the village parson, who argued passionately for the sanctity of his church and the graves of his parishioners. They wrote letters to Parliament. They held protest meetings in the Ashopton Inn, the very pub that was slated to be submerged. They argued logically that their valley was a living, breathing community, not an empty basin to be filled. They pointed out the historical significance of Derwent Hall, a Jacobean masterpiece. They argued for the sanctity of their churchyard, demanding to know what would happen to the bodies of their ancestors. But how can a village of a few hundred farmers win a fight against the combined industrial and political might of Sheffield, Derby, and Leicester? For every letter of protest from a villager, the water board countered with a brutal utilitarian argument. The health, sanitation, and economic future of millions of city dwellers, they argued, outweighed the sentimental attachments of a few hundred rural dwellers. It was a cold, hard mathematical equation of the greater good, and in this equation, the villages of Derwent and Ashopton were a rounding error. The Act of Parliament was passed in 1935, sealing their fate. The compulsory purchase orders were issued. The valley was to be flooded. The process of dying was slow and agonizingly methodical. The water board began buying up the properties one by one. Residents who had lived there for generations were offered a sum of money and told to be out. As families began to leave, the social fabric, woven over centuries, began to unravel. The village school lost its pupils. The local shop lost its customers. The community began to ghost itself long before the water arrived. Then came the exhumation. In a scene that feels like something from a Gothic horror story, the water board had to address the issue of the churchyard. Dozens of bodies were exhumed from the consecrated ground of Derwent's church. Coffins were raised from the earth, and the remains of the valley's ancestors were taken over the hill to be reinterred in the churchyard at the nearby village of Bamford. It was a desecration, however carefully and respectfully it was carried out. It was the ultimate violation, not just evicting the living, but evicting the dead. The final evacuees left their homes in 1943. Unlike Tynem, which was emptied in a single, sudden act, this was a slow-motion tragedy, drawn out over nearly a decade. The last service was held in Derwent's church. The last pint was pulled at the Ashopton Inn. As the houses emptied, the demolition crews moved in. Their job was to sanitize the valley. To prevent any buildings from collapsing and fouling the water, they had to be torn down. Derwent Hall, the grand manor, was reduced to rubble. The farms were dismantled, stone by stone, but they made one fateful exception: the church. They could not bring themselves to demolish the 17th century church, a consecrated building, so they left it. They simply left it standing. The valley was now empty. The homes were gone. The people were gone. The dead were gone. All that remained was a bare, scarred landscape and a single defiant church tower, waiting. In 1945, as the rest of the nation celebrated the end of the war, the great valves on the new 2,300-foot-wide Ladybower Dam were closed. The river Derwent was halted, and the water began to rise. The flooding was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow, creeping, silent death. As the giant valves of the Ladybower Dam closed in 1945, the river Derwent, choked for the first time in its existence, began to swell. The water had nowhere to go but up. Inch by inch, day by day, the valley floor began to disappear. Imagine the remaining villagers standing on the hillside at Bamford, looking down at their former lives. They watched as the water, murky and brown, crept across the fields they had plowed, swallowing the ancient stone walls that had marked their family's land for generations. They watched as it lapped at the doorsteps of their former homes, or rather, the rubble piles that remained. The water rose, consuming the village green, the schoolhouse foundations, the old stone bridge. It slowly climbed the walls of the Ashopton Inn, until the entire village of Ashopton, the valley's bustling crossroads, was completely submerged, vanishing from sight forever. But the village of Derwent, being slightly higher up, was the last to go, and its church, the one building left standing, provided a final, theatrical, and utterly haunting spectacle. The water reached the churchyard, covering the empty graves. It climbed the ancient stone walls. It poured through the windows and the oak doors. It filled the nave, submerging the pews, the altar, and the font where generations had been christened. Slowly, relentlessly, the entire body of the 17th century church was swallowed by the new, cold, man-made lake. Finally, the water covered the roof. But it was not deep enough. Not quite. In an act of profound, accidental symbolism, the church's stone spire remained. For months and then for years, the spire of Derwent Church pierced the surface of the Ladybower Reservoir. It stood as a lonely, defiant tombstone, a single accusing finger pointing up from the drowned world below. It was the valley's ghost, refusing to be buried. This image became a sensation. It was a gothic, melancholic icon that drew crowds of morbid sightseers. They would row boats out onto the new reservoir, paddling around the steeple, staring down into the dark water, trying to make out the shapes of the village beneath them. It was a spectacle of profound sadness, a physical monument to a community sacrificed for industrial thirst. The authorities, however, saw it differently. To them, it was not a memorial. It was a hazard to navigation. It was a problem. The spire survived for 2 more years. It stood through the winter of 1946, a dark silhouette against the snow. But in the winter of 1947, a harsh frost, combined with the relentless pressure of the water, finally did what the demolition crews had not. The spire cracked, crumbled, and collapsed into the reservoir. The valley's last defiant voice was silenced. But the haunting was not over. For decades, a second ghost remained. This one was architectural. The main road from Sheffield to Manchester, the A57, had once run directly through Ashopton. Now it had to be diverted, and a huge new viaduct, the Ashopton Viaduct, was built to carry the road over the newly flooded valley. For 50 years, drivers crossing that bridge would look down, and in the dark waters, they could still see the shadow of the old Ashopton Inn. And then came the droughts. In 1976, and again in the brutally hot, dry summer of 1989, the water levels of Ladybower dropped dramatically, and the village of Derwent returned. The water receded, and the drowned world emerged. It was an apocalyptic sight. The foundations of the village, the stumps of the church, the layout of the streets all reappeared, coated in a thick, dark, prehistoric slime. The old stone bridge, perfectly preserved, rose from the water. Crowds of people flocked to the reservoir, not to sail on it, but to walk on its bed. They were walking through the streets of a British Atlantis, a town that had returned from the dead. It was a stark, muddy reminder that the past, no matter how deeply you bury it, is never truly gone. Today, the Ladybower Reservoir is simply a fact. It is a vast, accepted, and undeniably beautiful feature of the landscape. The millions of people in Sheffield, Derby, and Leicester who turn on their taps have no idea of the sacrifice that was made for their convenience. The story of Derwent and Ashopton has itself been submerged by time, but this was not an isolated incident. The story of Derwent is not unique. It is, in fact, the most famous example of a dark and recurring chapter in British history. The industrial thirst of the 20th century, followed by the post-war demand for nuclear power and forestry, created a pattern of sacrificing deep, isolated valleys and the communities that lived in them. Travel to Wales and you will find the ghost of Capel Sealan. This was a fiercely Welsh-speaking village in the Tryweryn Valley, a heartland of Welsh culture. In 1957, a bill was passed by Parliament over the unanimous objection of every single Welsh MP to drown it. The purpose? To create a reservoir Lyn Selen to provide water not for Wales, but for the English city of Liverpool. It was an act of such profound political and cultural arrogance that it triggered the birth of the modern Welsh nationalist movement. To this day, the slogan, Cofiwch Tryweryn, remember Tryweryn, is a rallying cry against English overreach. Travel to Northumbria and you will find the Kielder Water, the largest man-made lake in northern Europe. Beneath its surface lies the drowned village of Falstone, another community erased for a reservoir. Travel back to the Peak District, and you will find the story of Mardale Green, a village in Cumbria, drowned to create the Haweswater Reservoir for the city of Manchester. Just like at Derwent, when the water levels drop, Mardale's ghost village reappears, its ancient stone walls and the foundations of its pub, the Dun Bull Inn, emerging from the mud. These are Britain's lost Atlantises. They are the invisible, uncounted casualties of the modern age. They are the places where the greater good was invoked as a weapon to erase the homes of the few, for the benefit of the many. Unlike Tyneham, there is no ambiguity here. There was no promise broken, because there was no promise made. There was only a cold, hard decision, a compulsory purchase, and an eviction order. The story of Derwent is a starker, colder tragedy. It is the story of a community that was looked at, weighed, measured, and found to be worth less than the water that would eventually cover it. Today, the Ashopton Viaduct carries thousands of cars a day over the reservoir. The drivers are looking at the view, at the water, at the forests. They have no idea that they are driving directly over the old village crossroads, over the foundations of the Ashopton Inn. The church spire is long gone. The ruins only reappear once in a generation, during the most extreme droughts. But the villages are still there. They are silent, preserved in the cold, dark, peat-stained water, a permanent underwater memorial to the brutal price of progress.